but my name is Eleanor. I am a current master's student in global and imperial history at Balliol College at Oxford, and I'm really excited to be joining you guys today as part of this incredible series to talk a little bit about maybe a different perspective on the Cold War than you guys have had, although I would love to hear as we go throughout the presentation, through the chat, what you guys have been learning so far, and offering a different perspective on, I'm sure, many stories and many different kinds of histories and ways of learning about the Cold War that you've had so far this term. But I'll go ahead and get started. So we're looking today at the not so, in parentheses, Cold War. This is anti-communism and violence in global perspective. So the outline for today's talk, we're going to start off with the questions of whose thermometer and whose war. So when we call something a Cold War, who says it's cold? And why is it referred to as a singular war as opposed to multiple? Where is this term coming from? Who has written it and who does it apply to? In the second part of the talk, we'll look into global hot wars between 1945, so right after World War II, and then 1990 or 1991, commonly thought of as the end of the Cold War. And then the final section will turn toward history's reheating and reheating history, so different ways that the legacy of the not-so-Cold War continue to impact both present-day events, but also our understanding of history today. So starting off with the first set of questions, why do we call the Cold War cold? And for which countries and regions of the world does this descriptor apply or not? So I'm going to start off by looking at two leading definitions of what the Cold War is. This one is coming from the Cambridge Dictionary, so it's the authority on British English. And they define the Cold War as, generally speaking, some state of extreme unfriendliness between countries, especially those with opposing political systems. And importantly for them, it's not expressed through fighting, so not through military conflict, but through political pressure and threats. And so they also note that this is usually used about the US and the Soviet Union, but also it's generally referred to as kind of an ideological but nonviolent, largely, battle between two opposing systems of thought. Because I'm American, I'm also going to give you the American definition. And this is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. They're both very, very similar. This one also defines Cold War, lowercase c, so general idea of a Cold War, as a conflict over ideological differences, again, not necessarily military ones, by methods short of sustained overt military action. So this would mean that they're not formally fighting one another in conflicts or anything like that, and usually without breaking off diplomatic relations. And then also, again, highlighting that what we consider and what you guys have been learning about as the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union during the second half of the 20th century was largely ideological. And so I've highlighted all of those parts of the definitions because it really shows part of the reason why the Cold War is called cold. It's because, as I'm sure you guys have learned in your previous sessions, there was no formal military confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union, and presumably a lot of the conflict took place in the realm of ideology between the spheres of communism and capitalism. So this is what a typical map of the Cold War might look like. I have a tiny little note on the side that this is the only time you should use Wikipedia for historical research. This is because it's giving you kind of what a common understanding of the Cold War would look like. Wikipedia is a crowdsourced kind of common hub of knowledge. But again, I'm sure as your teachers have all told you, anytime you're ever going to reference Wikipedia for anything, you should always look specifically for the source that somebody uses. But I pulled this one just because I wanted to understand and give an example of what a common understanding of what major conflicts and combatants in the Cold War looked like. So you guys are welcome to use the chat for this one, but what do you think this map suggests about the main sites of the Cold War conflicts? So we're thinking about the different shading on the map. We're thinking about which countries and which regions are given prominence. It kind of looks like the shading is the darkest in the United States. And so the blues are all representing NATO members led by the United States. The United Kingdom is up there as well. The lighter blues are countries that were aligned with these states or those who were still colonies of those states. And then on the other side in the red, you see the Warsaw Pact led by the USSR, as well as countries that were aligned with their ideology. And then in between, you see there's a pretty large number of countries in Africa and then also in particularly South and Southeast Asia that are just colored gray. And so it kind of implied that maybe they didn't have as much stake in the conflict. They weren't really primary combatants. There's also China, which is colored red because it was a communist country, but it wasn't formally aligned with the USSR at the time. So the maps from 1962, the actual breakdown of these alliances shifted a little bit over the course of the late 20th century as more colonies became independent. But this is generally, when you think of the Cold War, the way that the division of the world looked. So it's often described as the three worlds, the first world being the NATO-led world, the second world being the USSR-led world, and then the third world being the kind of non-aligned world. But I'm going to show you a different map of the Cold War conflict today. This one is showing hot conflicts of Cold War One, which might seem like an oxymoron. How can you have a hot conflict in a Cold War? But there were quite a few conflicts that took place throughout the latter half of the 20th century that did involve military interaction and intervention. And so this looks a little bit different. I'll go back to the other one. If you can see, the countries that were formerly shaded in dark colors are now completely white. And a lot of the countries which were either lightly shaded or, as in the case for several of the African countries, not shaded at all, are actually colored in right now. And so this implies that there's something a little bit different about who is in broader tellings of history. We're kind of the main actors in the Cold War, but then who actually experienced a lot of the military conflicts that took place within the Cold War. And some of these are quite well-known conflicts. So let's zoom in on some of these hotspots. The orange ones, according to that map, are the ones where there was direct action by the US or the USSR that took place. So they actually had troops on the ground fighting some of these battles. One of the most famous ones is Vietnam. This took place for about 20 years, from 1955 to 1975. This led to, I mean, it was quite a hot war. Like, this is undeniably a war that was not simply just kind of like a tiny ideological skirmish. It lasted for 2 decades. Um, Up to 3.4 million people were killed, and of those, up to 2 million of them were Vietnamese civilians, so not even soldiers of the Viet Cong army, the Viet Minh army, or of the United States. This number also doesn't include civilians that were killed in the civil wars of Laos and Cambodia, which are the neighboring Southeast Asian countries, or the refugees who died at sea escaping the violence. And so this one is very well known, I would say, within a lot of people's understandings of the Cold War in this time period. It was quite infamous. You also see Korea kind of up on the upper right-hand side, which is also pretty well known. There's Afghanistan, Cuba, Nicaragua, but some of the other yellow ones, just because they're not as darkly colored in, doesn't mean that they weren't also important. And it also doesn't mean that the U.S. and the USSR were the only ones that kind of had military stake in a lot of these conflicts. So I'll give some examples where the United Kingdom was actively involved. These two countries here are Kenya on the left side in Africa, and then Malaysia on the right side in Southeast Asia. And these were the sites of two conflicts that British historiography, so the British retelling of history, calls emergencies. These took place roughly from during the 50s, but these are the Mau Mau and the Malayan emergencies. These were sites in which the British colonial government, along with, in the case of Malaysia, the subsequent independent state, fought against communist insurgents or communist resistance fighters. And so in Malaysia, there's this entire ethnic minority group called the Kikuyu who were herded into concentration camps, and about 20,000, up to 20,000 of them died, as well as Kenyan soldiers and British soldiers fighting on the opposite side of the conflict. In Malaysia, similar numbers were seen as well. So around 7,000 Malaysian insurgents were killed, along with a pretty large number of Malaysian civilians, soldiers, and then also British soldiers as well. So even the lesser hotspots of the Cold War were still quite hot and still led to quite a great degree of violence and death in those regions. So given these numbers, and given the scale and the amount of countries that are shaded in on this map, and you can imagine similar degrees of violence, death tolls, casualty tolls that took place in all of these countries. How did these hot wars happen if the war was ostensibly cold and ideological? And then why do we still describe this time period as a single Cold War as opposed to a series of hot wars? So the second part of this presentation, we're going to look into these hot wars, which took place from roughly 1945 to 1991, and focus in on a few questions. So first, how did US and Soviet foreign policy strategies spark these global conflicts during this period, even if they never fought each other directly on on the European continent, at least where the Soviet Union was, or in the United States? And then what were the dominant experiences of the so-called Cold War outside of Europe and America? So I mentioned a term earlier, it's historiography. It's a little bit of a mouthful, so you saw me stumble over it there too. And I'm not sure if you guys have had the chance to talk about this yet, but I'll give you a little brief definition because it's a really important part of studying history, if you're hoping to do that at the undergraduate or graduate level. So historiography is the study of the history and methodology of history as a discipline. So it's like the meta study of history. It's the history of history. Historiography is usually something that is associated with a particular place and a time. So for example, let's say you're thinking of one event in history. For example, Napoleon's empire. And maybe at one point, British historians think that it was a really good thing, and then about 30 years later, they think it was a really bad thing. That is a shift in historiography. That is a difference. It's a shift in the way that historians wrote about an act in history. And so historiography is always it's always fluctuating based on currents of the time in which historians are writing, and also as new sources and new voices become revealed about the time period at which they're writing. And so people can update and change the ways that they're writing their histories. So a mainstream historiography of the Cold War, and this is typically associated with the US and the UK, would be, and maybe you've heard similar things in previous sessions, maybe slightly conflicting ones, but this is one that I pulled from several kind of general sources on educational public-facing sources on the Cold War. And so you can roughly divide it into a few phases. One is the end of World War II, and that's when relations begin to cool. So that's when Germany, the defeated Axis power, becomes divided into 4 allied zones. And at the time, the Soviet Union was allied along with Britain, France, and the US. But as these relations cools, Winston Churchill's famous quote about the Iron Curtain descending across Europe comes to fruition. Between 47 and 49, the US began a containment strategy where they tried to stop the spread of communism from the borders of the Soviet Union. And so this led to the creation of several diplomatic strategies, including the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Rio Pact, the Brussels Pact, that are kind of trying to entice US allies to remain allied or remain part of a communist bloc or a capitalist bloc against the communist bloc. This is also when the Berlin blockade and airlift took place. And so this is when things start to get even more contentious and rivalrous between the Soviet and US allied blocs. Between 1949 and 1962 is commonly thought of as the coolest or iciest part of the Cold War. This is when, instead of just diplomatic alliances, there were the diplomatic and economic, there were the formation of actual military alliances, where if one of these countries were to be invaded by a country from the other pact, there would be kind of this expectation that you would also fight militarily against that invasion. So this is the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. Those ones were led by the US, and then the Warsaw Pact, which was the corresponding one led by the USSR. The two crises that took place during this time as well were the Cuban Missile Crisis and the construction of the Berlin Wall, which were arguably points at which the world became the closest to actually becoming embroiled in an all-out nuclear war. Between the 60s or during the 60s, 62 and 69, relations started to thaw a little bit. And so with the advance of nuclear technology, especially the USSR successfully testing its first nuclear bomb, both countries signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, which was that they tried to limit the amount of nuclear arms that were being sold, but also being passed along to other countries. And then 1969 to 1979 is commonly thought of as détente. This is when relations start thawing a lot. So Nixon visits the USSR and also China for the first time, and both countries signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, where they limit how much each of them can produce. So not just the spread of it to other countries, but internally within themselves. After this, things get a little bit more contentious, but ultimately it ends with the unraveling of the Soviet Union after there's a failed invasion of Afghanistan, and then the Berlin falls in 1991. So a really crude way, a really brief way of summing up what mainstream historiography says about the Cold War is that it was cold, and then it got colder, and then it started thawing, and then it thawed. And that's such a great, lovely way of putting it with a nice little bow on top. So, but let's think about this historiography, especially in light of the maps that we saw in the earlier section. Cold, colder, thawing, and then thawed. What's wrong with this? Well, nothing is factually inaccurate about it. All those events that I described on the previous slide are true, and they did take place. But it is a telling of Cold War history from the perspective of nations that stayed cold. It's from the perspective of nations where on that map of the hotspots, their borders were not colored in. And what would this look like if historiography was created from the perspective of these nations that did experience hot conflict at the time? But in order to get into that point about what a different version of telling Cold War history would look like, we have to understand why and how these hot wars began. So a few key foreign policy strategies that contributed to the start of hot wars were first beginning with the US's strategy of containment. So this was coined by a diplomat, George Kennan, in 1947. So it's a strategy which aimed to stop the spread of communism by providing military and economic aid to countries who were resisting internal movements. So whether there was a kind of communist insurgency or outside pressure. So for example, Soviet expansion actively on their borders. This was paired with the advance of domino theory, which is something that was popularized by US President Eisenhower in the 1950s. So it was this other theory in US foreign policy, which meant that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would fall as well. And this is one that became very prominent, for example, in the strategy of Vietnam, which was, you can see to Nixon is pointing out on the right side, wherein they worried that if Vietnam fell to communist forces, so would Cambodia, so would Laos, and therefore they had to intervene. This was also paired with something called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was the USSR's sort of response to these two US foreign policy doctrines. It called on the USSR to intervene with military force, if necessary, in countries where they thought that communist rule was under threat. So both countries have this strategy of protecting their kind of sphere of communist or capitalist influence, but then also actively intervening in cases where they think it could lead to outside threats in order to prevent the spread of the other ideology. But because these two were diametrically opposed, this led to proxy wars. So these took place roughly between 1950 and 1991. And a proxy war is a conflict in which third parties, so in this case, the US and the USSR, support combatants on either side in order to influence the outcomes of these wars, and then also to advance their own strategic or ideological interests. To sum it all up, this was kind of the golden rule then of US Cold War strategy. In order to protect global freedom, which was part of the main concern of US's involvement in, or at least the professed concern of US involvement in the Cold War, give aid to foreign leaders that fight communism internally or on their borders, and then support armed resistance against the ones that don't. So whether that armed resistance came from an actual state group or it actually came from rebellious actors inside, as long as they were fighting against a communist power, they were going to receive US aid. And now this formulation, the idea that aiding these kinds of fights against communism would ultimately protect global freedom, that formulation works when capitalism has a very clear correlation to freedom. But in a lot of these cases, things were not quite so clear. What about countries where there was a communist leader who was freely and democratically elected? Is it supporting freedom to intervene in that country's politics or to violently depose them? That being said, at the same time, what if an alternative leader in a country is repressive and authoritarian, and that's your only option for a capitalist ally? Is that also supporting freedom? And then what happens when countries caught in the middle also experience the Soviet Union pursuing a diametrically opposed strategy? As you can see, this becomes quite explosive. So here's one example with Chile, which is a country in South America. So in the late 1960s, a leftist leader was preparing to launch an election campaign and needed to receive some Soviet funding. But US security personnel feared communist presence within the Western Hemisphere because they felt that was their sphere of influence for capitalism. And so they started developing plans for election interference. Despite their interference, which included a lot of propaganda, Allende was ultimately elected president of Chile. He won by a large margin. And after he won, he proposed the naturalization of mining industries. And so within communist and capitalist ideology, having state control and state ownership of the means of production and of certain economic industries is a pretty key idea that belongs to communism. And so this seemingly confirmed US fears that Allende would pursue an aggressive communist strategy and that ultimately other countries in Latin America would follow suit. So with this fear, the US backed a coup by a right-wing general, Augusto Pinochet, and they deposed the democratically elected Allende. Unfortunately, Pinochet established an authoritarian dictatorship after this US backing for him to be in power. He ended up killing more than 3,000 dissidents. He imprisoned over 30,000 more. And at the time, the US disavowed this violence because it was on face contradictory with their principle of supporting global freedom. But behind the scenes, because they were really concerned about maintaining the presence of capitalism, they supported his economic agenda. And so this was quite a key contradiction in US foreign policy. It led to quite a few protests in the sight of the United States as well as in Chile. But this is one of those cases where it was not such a clear-cut distinction between fighting communism and then supporting the rights of people to choose their own governors. A second case, which is a little bit closer to home for the Soviet Union, was Afghanistan. So in In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and then installed a military puppet leader because previously the leader in Afghanistan had been Soviet friendly, but they wanted to make sure that they maintained that kind of influence because similar to the way that Chile operated within the US sphere of influence, Afghanistan was right on the border of the Soviet Union. And so they wanted to ensure that communism would remain strong there. And this again was in line with the Brezhnev Doctrine, which is the corollary to the US's version of foreign policy strategies, where you have to make sure that you intervene in case there is any threat that one of your allied countries might fall to prevent that from happening in neighboring countries. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and after a war broke out, the US began to funnel money and weapons to a loose coalition of guerrilla fighters known as the Mujahideen. And in the ensuing conflict, up to 1.5 million Afghan civilians were killed. And so this kind of sowed the seeds for contemporary conflict and an ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. By 1989, the Soviet troops had withdrawn. It was a very costly and prolonged war. Many historians kind of attribute that to the fall of the Soviet Union overall. But this left a power vacuum within Afghanistan. And some of those resistance fighters subsequently united to form to the Taliban, and then seized power in Afghanistan. And so the resistance fighters and the kind of movement that the US had helped to fund because they were fighting against communism ultimately ended up carrying some ideologies that were quite antithetical to other ones about civil liberties, women's rights, and whatnot that were associated with other elements of US foreign policy. And so ultimately, you see this kind of contradiction where then later on, the United States does the same thing and invades Afghanistan because some of the groups that had sort of indirectly led to their rise were then contrary to a lot of the principles that it sought to espouse on the global stage. And so these are two cases where there was not such a quite a clear-cut correlation between the US's ability to intervene or the USSR's ability to intervene, and then the outcomes that were ultimately gained from those interventions. And several countries were also torn apart by these wars, like physically, not just in the sense of leading to not unideal forms of governments afterwards. So there's a few famous examples. West Germany and East Germany were obviously divided in half, as well as North Vietnam and South Vietnam divided in half across one of the parallels. But these two countries ultimately became united after the end of the Cold War. On the other hand, there are two countries that did not make it back to unification. And so famously, North Korea and South Korea are still divided, as well as Moldova is now a separate part where it formerly was part of Romania. But even non-aligned countries experienced mass violence. So the non-aligned movement was a movement that began in 1961 following an earlier conference of nations that had just become independent after colonial rule. And they resented and rejected the notion of kind of being used as pawns within a larger power play between the US and the USSR, between many of their former imperial masters. And so one of the leading countries of this movement was Indonesia. It was one of the co-founders of the non-aligned movement. And so in the earlier map that I pulled from Wikipedia that I showed you guys, it doesn't place it on the kind of alignment map between the US and the USSR because that was its explicit political stance at the time. And this was both a moral but also a political choice. That being said, that didn't mean it didn't escape violence. So because of the broader milieu of anti-communist violence, but also the funding that was taking place both for communist insurgencies and then also the US's military and economic investment in fighting communism, these broader battles ended up seeping down to many different countries within their own forms of governance. So in Indonesia, between 1965 and 1966, there were mass army-led killings of Communist Party members and ethnic minorities in what is in some cases known as a genocide, or some cases referred to. And in this case, up to 1 million people were killed. So even those who were not explicitly part of the war between the US and USSR could not escape the violence for the most part that played out with US funding and Soviet funding on both sides of the conflict. So let's return back to this map, right? So I've talked a bit about Chile, which is over there in Latin America on the left side, Afghanistan, which is in the center, Vietnam, Kenya, and then Indonesia and Malaysia down there. Each of these countries that are colored in on the map, plus several not highlighted on this map. So for example, at Baileo, I study the Philippines, which is another Southeast Asian country that's to the right side of the map. It's not colored on this map, which would imply that there was no violence that was necessarily experienced in the site at the time. And yet there is a similar experience to Indonesia, where both Indonesia and Chile, where an authoritarian dictator took power and used kind of like the narrative of anti-communism to round up a lot of his political dissidents, imprison them, torture them, and kill them. And so the broader narrative conflict between communism and capitalism um, was also very present and led to very violent and real results in a lot of places that aren't even necessarily highlighted on this map or in mainstream historiography. But each of these countries and more experienced large-scale acts of violence that dramatically altered their societies, their economies, and their politics going into the 21st century. From 1945 to 1991, 20 million lives were lost in proxy wars. Millions more civilians were injured or displaced, and whole countries were ripped apart. So who gets to claim that the Cold War was cold? And whose experience of history is erased or belittled by this narrative? This brings us to the third part of today's presentation, which is history's reheating and reheating history. So what are the ongoing legacies of Cold War violence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America today? How are these histories reheating? And should we narrate history differently? Should we reheat history to acknowledge the range of global Cold War experiences? Here are some examples of legacies of violence at old Cold War battlegrounds. So in Laos, which is one of the countries that borders Vietnam and that US strategists were concerned about falling in domino theory if Vietnam were to be taken over by communist powers, is the most heavily bombed country in the world per capita. So Laos was not formally a combatant in the Vietnam War. It just happened to be next to Vietnam, and there was a route that Viet Cong fighters were using to go and in their guerrilla war against the United States forces. And as a result, the US dropped 2 million cluster bombs on Laos in that northern route during the Vietnam War, even though Laos was not formally one of the parties, nor was it formally a communist country. And this led to massive amounts of civilian death. There are still 30% of those bombs that have been dropped did not detonate, which means they're actively lying in sites around the country, potentially waiting to explode if anyone happens to stumble upon them. And since the war ended, so after the violence was formally supposed to end, 20,000 people have been killed or injured by those bombs. 40% of them have been children. And so you can see in the picture on the right that there's still this ongoing cleanup effort that happens in Laos because the location of many of these bombs are unknown, and also their detonation status is unknown. On the flip side, and potentially a little bit more of an optimistic version, in Kenya, which I talked about briefly at the beginning, survivors of some of those detention camps that were run by the British during the Mama uprising in the 50s resisted some official attempts to erase all records. And so, and leaving Kenya after Kenya's independence, British officials tried to destroy a lot of those records, which had kept notes about the kinds of torture or sexual assault that were inflicted upon people who had been housed in there. And in resisting those official attempts at erasure, and also through methods such as oral history and interviews, they were able to successfully sue the British government for 20 million pounds in 2013. And so for these people, even though the emergency had taken place decades before, it was still impacting their daily life and the life of their descendants years and years and years later. And so they were able to reignite, or at least raise awareness about the toll that this history had taken on them and on their families in order to gain some restitution for the violence that they had experienced. So why does it matter if we call something a Cold War or a hot war, and if we acknowledge that some of these legacies are ongoing or incomplete? My argument, and you guys are all, of course, the idea of with all these history presentations and many of these, is that you're also furnished with the information and the tools to create your own interpretations of them as well. But I think in this case, language pretty clearly reflects and creates memory. So two alternate examples of how the Cold War is remembered are Vietnam. The Vietnamese government officially refers to the period of conflict from 1955 to 1975, which we call the Vietnam War, as the resistance war against America to save the nation. In Cuba, the conflict with the United States, instead of the Cuban Missile Crisis or instead of the Cold War broadly, is la lucha contra el imperialismo, which is the fight against imperialism. And these names, of course, just as our own calling of something the Cold War, reflects these countries' own place-specific and time-specific, so in that way also biased, historiographies, but they still reveal an important fact, which is that the Cold War is narrated differently in regions that experienced direct violence than in places that didn't. for example, the US and the UK. And while this might be politicized, it's also political to imply that there was no violence during this period, that a war that was experienced by millions of people around the world as something hot was actually and predominantly cold. It's just as political to say that there was little to no violence as there is to say that these wars were of resistance or of imperialism. Why does this distinction matter between calling the Cold War something that was ideological and contained and largely nonviolent? Well, I showed you guys this map in the beginning of the presentation, which is putting out or noting the different hot conflicts of Cold War One. And some of you might have picked this up, but it does say Cold War One, which is a really interesting frame that implies that maybe there's a second Cold War, right? And so this is exactly what the author of this map and of the article that it came from is trying to say. It's saying that we're in Cold War Two. And this, of course, is another person's own particular interpretation of the current event that we're living in. But the point is that as tensions continue to arise between the US and the USSR, as well as other powers today, we're entering something that looks somewhat similar to, if not exactly the same, but still similar to the tensions and the dynamics during Cold War II. And things like proxy wars continue to play a large role. So the ones that the author lists are Ukraine, Syria, and Gaza. All of these conflicts, and all, of course, they've taken different dimensions in the years since this article was written. But all of these have captured the international attention as they almost seem surprising, right? In many cases, I think there was quite a bit of surprise about the original Russian invasion of Ukraine or the scale of violence that was taking place in Syria and Gaza. But if you change your attention of history to think of the Cold War as something that actually was primarily, or not even primarily, but did have a large element of violence and did take place largely through theaters of small wars, the reason why things like these continue to resurge throughout contemporary times, even as we have frameworks like the UN and other global peacekeeping frameworks, it makes more sense when you start incorporating the history of hot wars into our understanding of the history of the Cold War. So what do we gain, in summary, if we write the hot back into Cold War history? My argument is that we gain a better understanding of how and why proxy conflicts are still unfolding in the world today. What do we lose? We lose the myth that the Cold War was a victorious and largely nonviolent US and UK led fight for freedom. Yes, it did topple the Soviet Union and contested a lot of authoritarian and repressive regimes worldwide, but it also fueled untold loss and destruction, and also enabled a lot of those authoritarian and repressive regimes worldwide. In order to be good historians about the Cold War, we must tell the whole story. So I'm going to end with a little bit of a summary of what we talked about today, but then it looks like we'll definitely have time for questions. So I'm going to lead off with a review of the three different sections that we talked about. So we started off with whose thermometer and whose wars. In the United States and the UK, we often refer to the period after World War II as the Cold War, but for many other parts of the world, this time period was incredibly violent and hot. In the section on the hot wars, we reviewed a lot of the proxy wars. And so countries across Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America experienced deadly US and Soviet proxy wars or military interventions, regardless of whether they were formally allied with a superpower or not. This example being Indonesia, as I gave. And then finally, in history's reheating and reheating history, we looked at the legacies of these conflicts. These violent histories had legacies that continue to reheat in contemporary conflicts or cause continuing damage and destruction, as seen in the case of Laos. Should we warm up our narration of the Cold War to feature them more prominently? I leave this question for you guys as you continue to learn more about the Cold War, the way that it's written in history, and also the way that it's understood in a variety of other humanities and social science fields. But for now, with that summary, I'll also give you the references that I used for this presentation, as well as some further reading if you have any interest in the ways that the Cold War was experienced as hot by multiple countries and regions around the world. But for now, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be able to talk with you guys today.